Coffee is one of the earliest commodities in the process of globalization, one of the early to be colonized. After sugar, one of those to be involved in slavery. It is one that has moved around the world. It is a good way of trying to understand globalization, both production and consumption. We can see here that coffee basically spans 20 degrees north and south from the equator. So in the north as far as Hawaii, and in the south as far as Paraná, Brazil, though my coffee tree does have some cherries that are ripening, so at least as far north as Southern California. But I'm not going to be exporting, so we won't include that. Okay, so coffee is also important because it's involved in the notions of dependency theory, an idea that the world was Janus face divided, so it's a unity, but looking in two very different directions, where the consumers are involved in the Enlightenment and capitalism and bourgeois relations and the public sphere, all these things coming out of the coffee house, whereas on the other hand, the notion in the literature was that the producers were people who were going to be suffering oppression, poverty, oligarchic government, rural, poor social services. So really entire opposites according to dependency theory. And so that's another reason to examine it. We could also include reasons for coffee being important is that it is, you said I could say this, the second most important, second most valuable internationally traded good from the southern countries. It took some work to get that out because normally they say in the world, and it's not the second most in the world. But from the global southern countries, it is the second most valuable. It's claimed 25 million people make their living from coffee. There are 70 countries that grow coffee, 50 that export coffee. It is something that reflects, and it's grown on every continent but Europe and Antarctica. So, yeah, that's right. There's a little bit in Australia. So it is really has a global sweep and allows us to think globally. It is also something because of this very many different aspects of it, of the coffee house, the agronomist, the peasant, the farmer, the religious, and I will point all these out. It has also been approached. I use a term that my editor doesn't like, which is the caffeinated elephant. This comes from the poem of the 6 blind men, each one grabbing a different part, and the tail was like a broom, and the tusk was a spear, and the legs were a tree. And so each one thought they were grabbing something different. And that's really how much of the literature of coffee has been. I'm trying to, perhaps ridiculous task, of combine all these, because you can see it's really just one animal. And so all these different things are related on the consumption production side, but it's something that is going to be changing over time. Okay, so what I'm going to do is kind of just give you some summing up the 40-page paper. I just sent my editor kind of a synopsis of the chapters, and that was 75 pages. So here's what you would get after 10 weeks in my class. Okay, so coffee has wandered over the globe. It's not one place. It started in one place in Yemen. From Yemen, in terms of production, moved to Java, Reunion, eventually over to the Caribbean, Brazil, and now also very importantly in different parts of Asia. So it's moved around. What they've grown has changed. A number of different things are adopted over time. It's coffee itself was developed for its own needs, for procreation, caffeine to defend itself from pests, but humans have come and chosen the cultivars over time, though it's still not yet, not a lot of genetically modification yet with coffee. The scale has changed very much over time, beginning with gardens up in the mountains of Yemen, moving down to plantations, and today mostly small crops. And another point that dependency theory would argue it's all these vast plantations, but it's not. Today, coffee is mainly grown on small farms. There aren't very many large farms. Who governed the commodity chains changed over time. Early it was merchants in Yemen getting coffee in the local markets and then sending it out to pilgrims and then further up to Constantinople or down to India or to Java. Later we've got British and French and Dutch companies coming in, and they're also trading with coffee, eventually setting up colonial governments to oversee it in places like Java, Ceylon, Réunion, and in the Caribbean, Martinique, Haiti. After that, we get roasters who are going to be preeminent as the colonial regimes lose control. Coffee was only significant colonial product for about 100 years. And after the roasters, it's governments, because coffee is one of the first products in which the producers, in third world producers, or actually one producer, was able to create the valorization program to prop up the price of coffee, created its own warehouses, banks, and then eventually brought in other producers. So we get a Pan-American, and then the United States joins in, and eventually a worldwide control of coffee prices between 1962 and 1989, 27 years. So coffee is different from other products. I don't have time to go into this, but it's one of the points I do want to make is when we're studying trade or studying so-called commodities, because it's not just a commodity, that we have to look at the particular plant and what it does, why people want it. I mean, it makes a difference if it's a food product or if it's wood. And we have to look at what about its growth will make it easier or harder to grow in other places, because coffee can't grow everywhere. It takes 4 to 6 years for a seedling to grow up. Then it's going to have maybe 20 years. Some of these, and it doesn't perish, so that they were able to hold it off the market for years if they needed to. You couldn't do that very well with raspberries. So my point is, there are inherent things in coffee that made this possible. So it's not just everything fungible, everything, that this one size fits all. Coffee is particular, okay, is unusual in all of this. Then we move down, so we move into the International Coffee Organization. Today, more multinationals, but we also have some specialty coffee is actually quite significant. We've talked about fair trade. Specialty Coffee Association claims that something like 40% by value and size of the U.S. market is specialty coffee. I'm doubtful of that, but that's what they're claiming. They say it's coffee. They're not just the cream and sugar in the cup. So. Okay. Over time, coffee became commodified. It didn't start as a commodity. If you start studying in 1970, then that's maybe not an issue, but it's an interesting process. And it wasn't obvious that it was going to become a commodity. I mean, when it began, it wasn't. The Ethiopians were very slow to sell it to markets. They ate it, in fact. It was quite a while before they even were going to drink it. Eventually, it comes over to Yemen, and they're going to make it into a drink. But even so, a lot of it was for Sufi who were using it for religious reasons. They were mystics. They were anti-imperialist. It wasn't something to make money. It was something to escape the world. That's domesticated and exported. And then eventually, after 200 years, this is not a European crop. It's a crop for 200 years dominated by Muslims, both in production in Yemen and in consumption in the Middle East and India. Eventually, the Europeans kind of creep in and start participating and certainly expanding the market quite a bit. So it becomes eventually a basis of individual and government wealth and power. Speculation, futures only begin in the 1880s. They get coffee markets established in Le Havre, in Hamburg, and in New York. And they're going to start coffee futures so that there's some speculation going on. Before that, there wasn't, and there wasn't this general concept of what is coffee. Then we move fair trade, which I would argue to some extent is trying to decommodify, and I know people here disagree with that. We can fight that out later. Okay, so what I'm arguing is, although coffee is a commodity, I mean, I think Apatarai, Arjun Apatarai, the anthropologist, talking about the social life of things, that you don't always buy something because of its market value to be bought or sold, that these also have a lot of values that are social values that are, I feel like I'm back in Ethiopia. So coffee is a plant or a seed, so humans can't just enforce what they want. Coffee rusts come along. We have to remember it is a product of nature. It was initially an energy drink for soldiers and for warriors and workers, and in fact an addictive drug, not just certainly a commodity. It became, sometimes people use coffee like tea for divination of the future. Anyway, all these other sorts of points. These are sorts of appeals that coffee makes that, yes, can be commodified, but people don't necessarily use it or buy it or like it because of the commodity aspect. So I think that if you want to talk about ideologies, I think the ideology of commodification is one that we perhaps are not sufficiently sensitive to. And I think coffee is somewhat unusual in some of this. Okay. And then all these other sorts of things that we can think of was important in revolutions, either from Paris to Vietnam, domestic aptitude, leisure drink, generation definition. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm under time constraints. So take my class. Okay. The producing areas, you're going to have a hard time following me, I'm sorry. The producing areas have changed dramatically. So we can say, yeah, coffee's been around for 500 years and they keep calling it coffee, but it's something different. It's growing in different places. No longer those early places, none of them are significant as producers now, not Yemen, not Haiti, not Jamaica, Reunion. Brazil is the one kind of place that since about 1820 has remained a very important producer, but other ones only came on late. Colombia at the end of the 19th century. And in the last 30 or 40 years, a bunch of other new countries, Vietnam the most prominent, have come in and started being producers. So what appears to be a continuity in an age-old market is one that is full of a lot of changes, new people are selling to, new product actually that they're growing and selling. So yeah, countries like Honduras, Peru, Bolivia, they were never growing coffee before. Ethiopia never on the scale that it's growing today. And Vietnam wasn't doing it before. Consumption has also changed. The early people who were the big drinkers in the Middle East are mainly now tea drinkers. So that has changed. And yet other people who were tea drinkers, the Japanese and the British, now drink more coffee. So habits change, and it's kind of an interesting thing to figure out why. What is it that convinced them that this is now a beverage that they prefer? They don't completely discard the old habits, but they're getting new. And part of it is because of a lot of new products. So it's becoming increasingly industrialized. And of course, one of the consequences of that, which is often lamented, but I think it's rather inevitable, is yes, the coffee that you buy in the store, only a very small portion of that price is going to go to the grower in the field, because it's now going to be processed and ground, and maybe it's going to be made into a drink and bottled, or put in Japan they put them in machines. So there are a whole lot of other steps. Whereas for the first century, it was being sold as a green bean, it was taken home, and it was fried at home, and it was ground, and so all those processes were home. They've all been taken over by the market. So we're getting a big difference between the final price and what the grower gets. On the other hand, I don't know, you don't really hear a lot of people lamenting the fact that the Idaho potato farmer is only getting a small share of the McDonald's potato price, or the cotton farmer a small share of the price of a Dior gown. I mean, it's sort of kind of inevitable in the industrialization of any sort of a product. All right. Who grows coffee seems to have remained sort of the same, Latin America, for the last 2 centuries, but it's changed within Latin America. Brazil is the one that has remained the same, but as I said, now old growers like Costa Rica, El Salvador, not so important anymore, and new ones like Peru, Honduras have become much more prominent. Asia, though, is really, which at the beginning of the 20th century had been wiped out because of leaf rust, is now producing over a third of the world's coffee. Yes, Vietnam is very important, but amongst the top 6 growers, we could also include India and Indonesia. So there's been a big shift. Africa, at least it's finally, even though it's native to Africa, only started exporting in any size at the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah, well, I came 15 hours, so I'm going to keep going a little bit. So, not coming, going. Okay, so Brazil and Vietnam, but another point, it is an asymmetrical market in the sense that 2 countries, it is small growers, 2 countries still have half of the world's coffee, Brazil and Vietnam. So there are 50 growers, but there are 2 that are most important. I'll go beyond that. Okay, so you can see here that it is not like everybody shares in this market the same. What is important about this, though, is that those 2 biggest growers have a very different position and vulnerability to coffee than do a lot of the small growers. And what you hear about from Oxfam is always the small guys, Rwanda, and lament their role in the world market, but it isn't because of coffee. For example, in the case of Brazil, Brazil is the world's largest exporter of coffee, has been except for 1 year, since about 1850. But, so they're producing a third of the world's coffee, but coffee only constitutes 2% of Brazil's exports. It's not very important to them in terms of exports, 0.3% of GDP. And it employs, maybe 1 million people. So, and with Vietnam, it is also only the 2nd most important export, and still, I don't have the exact number. Do you have the number? It's a small share of, it's a 2% of GDP as well. So, well, here I have a picture. Wait, okay, since I'm out of time. This gives you an example of the average share of coffee exports and total exports, and it's kind of inversely related. The bigger producer they are, the bigger share they have in the world economy, the less important it is domestically. And so coffee is kind of a bad gamble for countries that don't have anything else. And that really kind of raises the question, and actually worth discussing, is it that people are poor because they grow coffee? Or is it that poor people grow coffee because it's can be grown on small plots by family without a lot of capital investment? It doesn't make them poor. It is kind of a solution for, and in fact, this is certainly a lot of the aid companies are exactly going into poor countries and telling them to grow coffee because it's something you can do without a big investment. Okay, so I skipped a couple slides. Coffee hasn't been a colonial crop of importance really since the 1870s, so for like 150 years. It is not large estates for the most part. Even in Brazil, the average farm is 9 hectares. And in Ethiopia, it's a half an acre. Vietnam, it's 1 or 2 acres. So it isn't even grown on a large scale. Over time, the distinction between producer and consumer should be considered. If we assume, as we just heard, that only 5 cents of that final cup of coffee, of that value is the coffee, isn't much of the coffee you're buying being produced in the United States. Okay, so actually production is being produced also in the consuming countries. But consuming countries aren't just northern countries. Now, at least 25% of the coffee that's grown is consumed in the country in which it's grown. Brazil is consuming about 40% of its own crop, and they estimate that Ethiopia is consuming half of its own crop. Okay, and in other countries, in Colombia, Costa Rica, a lot of consumption at home. What does that mean? That means that it isn't just an export crop. And in fact, in all these countries, they're developing, not so much Vietnam, but certainly the Latin American countries, they're developing their own roasters, their own coffee houses, their own domestic. So that value that gets added, by Starbucks in the United States is being added by often local companies in the Latin American producing places. Okay. That the farmers have, even though the ICO, International Coffee Organization, no longer has such a large role in that, there's still some oversight, and there's some the largest exporter from Brazil is in fact a cooperative. So there still are other forms where they can come together and protect themselves. So the final point is that that coffee changes a lot over time, and there's a tremendous diversity. You can't just say, oh, coffee, it produces this. It depends a lot on the political will of the state. Brazil happened to be, even though it was a liberal state, because it had such a control over the world market and because they were concerned about their debts, that they were able to establish something which actually became the inspiration eventually for OPEC, that we're going to step in and we're going to try to prop up these prices. So whereas a lot of the poorer countries that are come to this as the last hope, they're not able to make these sorts of changes. So my last words are that I hope that I've convinced you that the world's most popular legal drug is not just a good thing to drink, but it's also a good thing to think, because it's very dynamic and because it's revealing of a lot of international relations. Thank you. And thank you for